The title of the next session is Why Permissionless Innovation Needs to be Defended. The internet and permissionless innovation has made life so much better for so many people. The next session features Google's Max Pappas, who will discuss why we must continuously defend against government intrusion in the tech space. Please join me in welcoming him to stage.
Hi, I'm Max Pappas from Google. So while the debate, hey Steve, good to see some familiar faces in the audience. I noticed the intro didn't include any background, so I was asked Thursday night how I got involved in this space, so get a little bit of background on that. I was the student of a professor named Walter Block, who was part of the Rothbard and Rand circles in the 60s, and gave me Paul Haynes' economic way of thinking when I was 18 years old. He's also the guy that connected me with the Cato Institute, where I began my career. Fast forward that through lots of work in the movement. I was Ted Cruz's chief economist for 4 years, and I've been at Google for the last year and a half, where, given my background, I manage their work with the world that I know very well. Is this echoey to you too? Okay, it's all right. So, while the debate over a physical wall currently dominates the American political discourse, there's little talk about the virtual walls that are being built around the world that threaten the internet as we know it. I'm going to go over 3 things today to bring light to this fact and to prepare you to engage. First, I'm going to discuss why you should be concerned about this, and you should be. Second, I'll go over 5 key areas of law that you should know about, and this part's going to show that libertarians are right. And third, I'll give you a framework that you can use when thinking about internet policy, so you can play a role in keeping it free. So first, why should you be concerned? Well, you should be concerned because the state is on the march, and it's going after the internet, the most libertarian thing in the world, and the best current empirical evidence that we have about a libertarian approach. This, of course, will harm innovation, which is a major driver of human progress. Surprisingly, libertarians are doing little to fight this government encroachment. My hope is that that begins to change today. What's not surprising is that the state is on the march. The internet has always been a transnational institution promoting a worldwide exchange of ideas, and incredible access to information, and facilitating economic exchange around states. And today we're seeing what you might call the revenge of the Westphalian order, the old world order of borders. As individual nations seek to assert more jurisdiction and control, leading to all sorts of legal and policy risks and the balkanization of the internet. All states, in one way or another, will ultimately reach out to try to control from the internet what they fear. They fear their lack of sovereign control on what comes through their borders on the internet. And they're already starting to put up the initial blocks to create these virtual fences. Of course, we shouldn't be surprised. As Thomas Jefferson noted, the natural progress of things is for government to gain ground and liberty to yield. And in the next section, I'm going to go over some of the details about where this is happening. But with the freedom it facilitates and the barriers that it breaks down, I think everybody in this room is going to be pretty familiar with how the internet's the most libertarian thing in the world. Well, maybe besides Reason Magazine. I don't know if Nick Gillespie's still around, but maybe that's a little bit more libertarian. But you can get it on the internet, so there you go. So I won't belabor that point. But there are a few related points that I'd like to go over that I think are important in making the libertarian case. Is that better if I step away? Are you getting it off the mic? No? I think there's some mic challenges. So first, over the last 25 years, more than 1 billion people have lifted themselves out of extreme poverty, and the global poverty rate is lower than it's ever been in the history of mankind. That is amazing. And no small part of that is the form of globalization that's facilitated by the fiber networks that connect people in China and Africa and India to people in Europe and the United States. In one lifetime, there's been a fundamental improvement in living standards around the world. We've lived through perhaps the greatest human achievement of all time. And it's been a result of innovation that's happened through the incentives that capitalism creates. As we'll discuss later, some of the key laws that the government changed to step back out of the way of innovation rather than into it in the 90s when it was happening. Second, the story of the internet economy is one of mutually beneficial and voluntary exchange, the heart of the libertarian economic argument. Let me tell you one example that I think shows that story. It's about HalloweenCostumes.com. It's an e-commerce business in Mankato, Minnesota. Why not pick a town with Cato in it while you're at Students for Liberty, right? So Mankato, Minnesota. The Falstein kids were the envy of their neighborhood thanks to their mom's amazing Halloween costumes. And in 1992, sisters Lisa, Heather, and Julie started renting out their old costumes from their garage to their friends. Their brother Tom joined part-time, and then he got a computer science degree. He started looking for new business online. To quote Tom, he said, "I started building websites in 2004, and by October of 2005, everything exploded." I'm telling you this because this is happening all over the place, and it's not well documented or well understood. They took over their mom's house, stocked inventory, started shipping packages. They ultimately had to unplug their phone. They couldn't take any more orders. Now what HalloweenCostume.com uses is Google AdWords as their advertising program. They now use it to bring in millions in sales. We put out a report, the Google's Economic Impact Report, that tells this story in every state. Now what's important here is the ads. The ads are the mutually beneficial product there. Google makes some money off of it, they find their customers off of it, and it pays for your searches. It used to be the LexisNexis model where you had to pay for your search. The ads-funded internet was the revolution. Everybody's benefiting. Now this company, from their humble beginnings, they've got a 200,000 square foot facility, 150 full-time staff, and 1,500 seasonal workers during Halloween. They've also launched some other sites to keep it going during the off-season. This is how business is done now. You can have a global business in your small town in the middle of the country, in a town apparently named after Cato, and ship all over the world. The economics of this are important because this is a big change. Pre-internet, they would have had to buy ads in their local penny saver. They would have to pay for all the eyeballs in that newspaper, trying to get this small percentage of people in their town who wanted to come by and buy costumes that they could hand them to. The internet has turned this all upside down in an amazing way. Now through Google AdWords, they advertise to everybody in the whole world, to probably the same small percentage of people who actually want to buy their costumes. But 0.001% of 5 billion is a lot more than 0.001% of 500 or 5,000. It's actually a way to sustain a business. It's a big, big deal. You know, it's a lot cheaper advertising per acquisition, and that keeps costs down for everybody, which makes purchasing power increase, which makes everybody richer. So that's the economic component. Then there's the knowledge component. Until just recently, within my lifetime, within some of yours, humans lived in a state of extreme information poverty. I remember going to the library with my parents when I was a kid. That was the realm of my access to information, my small town library. Google's head of search is from India. And he puts up this picture when he does a presentation. It's an Indian kid on a bike, back of his dad's bike, and he says, "This isn't much different from when I was a kid, except for one thing." You look closely and the kid's holding a smartphone. Ben Gomes is the name of our head of search at Google. He said he used to go to the library with his mom. There were no electrical engineering books. They could get 4 books. He could get 2, and his mom would get 2. But he said that boy on the back of his bike now, through that phone, has access to the history of knowledge of mankind. And were he able to read it, he could read whatever electrical engineering book he wants. That is incredible. Take the Encyclopedia Britannica. Remember, my grandfather had one. I used to go and look at it. Over the past 70 years or so, the size of Encyclopedia Britannica has remained relatively constant, around 500,000 topics. Then we have Wikipedia today. The English version covers more than 10 times that, 5.7 million topics versus 500,000. But of course, there's Wikipedia in over 300 languages. And Wikipedia in all the languages has almost 50 million articles, which is 100 times the Encyclopedia Britannica. Also amazing. Now, it's not a surprise that Wikipedia's founder knew his Hayek. He had read The Use of Knowledge in Society. If you haven't read Hayek's Use of Knowledge in Society, I can't recommend it high enough. I believe I see Josh Withrow in the back, who knows that I recommend that since we worked together, to everybody who I work with. So the key concept there, if you're not familiar with it, is this central command could never have the same knowledge of all the individuals spread out with their knowledge of time and place. That's the Wikipedia model. Open it up, let everybody with their knowledge of time and place contribute to it and edit it rather than the central command and control of a bunch of editors in a building at Britannica. This has implications for the internet at large and really all the platforms, because it points to the scale that we're talking about. I think the scale is poorly understood and not well known. You hear that when you hear a lot of anecdotes about what's happening on the internet as an alternative for data. And Josh and I both had a former boss who would say that anecdote does not equal data. A couple points on scale that are staggering. The web has trillions of pages. The average book has about 300. Google's index is 100 million gigabytes. And if we printed that index out on paper in book form, it's stacked to the moon and back 12 times. So you guess 4 or 5 words, we search that stack to the moon and back 12 times and pull up all the relevant information we think you're looking for. YouTube. YouTube has over 450 hours of YouTube uploaded every minute. That's 18 days worth of watching uploaded every minute. That's why the first scan of everything is through machine learning, which is another important advancement that I don't have time to get into today. In all, Google has 8 products with more than 1 billion users. These are massive scales. Now, let's talk a little bit about the laws that enabled this, because that's an important part of the discussion. There's 5 key areas of laws that I want you to know about that I think are going to illuminate how right libertarians have been, because they all happened around the same time and involved the government not getting in the way. But first, a historical point and then a quote. Before the early 90s, commercialization and commercial use of the internet was prohibited. In 1982, Massachusetts Institute of Technology would distribute a handbook to their students using the ARPANET, the precursor to the internet. And it said, quote, "It is considered illegal to use the ARPANET for anything which is not in direct support of government business. Sending electronic mail over the ARPANET for commercial profit or political purposes is both antisocial and illegal." I suspect you probably get some politically related emails from Students for Liberty these days. That was all legalized, and then the world changed for the better. Now I'm going to read you a quote, and I want you to think, as I'm reading it, who might have said this. Quote, "The private sector should lead, and the internet should develop as a market-driven arena, not a regulated industry. Governments should encourage industry self-regulation and private sector leadership where possible, and avoid undue restrictions. Parties should be able to enter into legitimate agreements to buy and sell products and services across the internet with minimal government involvement or intervention." And that could have been written by anybody in this room. I saw Tom Palmer was here earlier. You could have found that in one of his books. If anybody had the Clinton administration, I'll buy you a drink tonight. That was in the Clinton administration's Framework for Global Electronic Commerce, published in 1997, and it set the tone for a hands-off approach to the internet. The results over the ensuing 20 years show that that was the right approach. Shows that hands-off, when you let people free to pursue their own ends, individuals will do amazing things. But the internet's a global phenomenon. So how did the US and Silicon Valley specifically become the world's leading suppliers of internet services? The US got the laws right by having the government step back in the right places. In his paper, and I highly recommend it, I think this might be recommendation number 2 or 3, How Law Made Silicon Valley, Professor Anupam Changer notes the differences between the US approach and the European and Asian approach made all the difference. In the US, the preference for self-regulation over government intrusions would mark congressional activity and judicial decisions over the previous 20 years from that memo. Meanwhile, Europe and Asia, by contrast, imposed strict intermediary liability regimes, inflexible intellectual property right rules, strong privacy constraints, and they all impeded their local internet entrepreneurs. While American law favored both commercial and speech enabled by the internet, Europe and Asia jurisdictions attended more to the risks to intellectual property right holders and liability concerns. Innovations that might have been celebrated in the United States could lead to imprisonment in Japan. One famous Japanese computer science professor, for example, advised his students to publish their software outside of Japan for protection from liability lawsuits. In the UK, British Prime Minister David Cameron suggested that Google's search engine might have been illegal under English copyright laws. So I want to go into these 5 specific areas briefly so I don't go over time. The first, intermediary liability protection. There's a key law that was passed in the mid-90s called the Communications Decency Act. One important section of it remains, it's Section 230. You might hear it referred to as CDA 230. What this argued, or made law in the United States, was that internet platforms, which are transoms through which information flows, will not be held liable for the information that they may connect people to. And just a long way of saying, the bad guys doing the bad stuff will continue to be held liable for the bad stuff they do, rather than the people who might connect them to that information. Lawsuits are a big deal in business and in startups, and they're very costly. It's one way that competitors get sued into the ground. This is a very big deal. And this is credited with as perhaps being the most important law in the United States, which differentiates it substantially to the lack of intermediary liability protections that companies have in Europe and Asia. It's under big threat right now. This is the beginning of the moats going up, or the virtual walls. I think you're going to continue to hear a lot about this bill over the coming years. There was a bill passed last year that had to do with sex trafficking that used intermediary liability protection as a way to get the law passed, which is worth looking into. That's a fundamental law. It's in the US, it's in the new NAFTA, the USMCA, and that it's a good example of a US law that stepped the government back. In a lawsuit, you need the government to come in and enforce something and fine people, send people to jail. This is in the new NAFTA, and it's a piece of exporting a good piece of US law that facilitates entrepreneurship. Second, copyright laws. The seminal law here, I would say, is the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. The Digital Millennium Copyright Act, DMCA, not to be confused with the USMCA or Run DMC, checking if you're paying attention. The Digital Millennium Copyright Act provided what are called safe harbors for internet companies especially, where lots of copies of stuff gets passed back and forth. And it was a balance between the copyright holders' rights and allowing innovative technologies to come up, like YouTube, for example, where you have the right to a fair use of somebody else's video if you don't use too much of it, if you don't use the core essence of it, if you just use a snippet of it. That's a big deal. Most other laws leaned toward the other side of just the copyright holder and prevented similar things from popping up. The US isn't the only place where social networks, for example, were created. There were contemporary networks that were created in Japan and Europe, but they were unable to get off the ground because, one, they didn't have the liability protection that CDA 230 provides, or the safe harbors of fair use that DMCA provides. Third are privacy laws. It's a big issue of debate right now. The European Union initially took a very different approach and has gone even further now. They've recently passed something called GDPR, the acronym's too long to go over, GDPR, which is a very costly thing. It cost Google hundreds of man-years to figure out how to comply with this. Now, Google can afford that, but the next generation of innovative companies aren't going to be able to. And it's important to remember that with any regulation you hear about, is that the big incumbents that some feel maybe they're going to get with these laws, ultimately they'll be able to, for a deadweight loss, which is a loss to everybody, will pay the lawyers to come up with a way for the engineers to implement and comply. But the small startups won't be able to, and that's a shame. The US instead leaned on existing tort law. If something bad happens to you, you have recourse. They focused on that. They did pass some laws. There's the COPA law, which is the Child Online Privacy Protection Act, which specifically was to protect people under 13. Beyond that, above 13, there were the usual torts that you had. Fourth is competition policy. The US has what's called a consumer welfare standard. This is a pretty different view than what the Europeans have, where they look, so the US looks at, are there harms to consumers? The European looks at, are there harms to competitors? Well, if you come up with a better mousetrap, there are harms to competitors because you've got a better mousetrap than they do. Google has been fined substantially in the European Union for that, through what I would call antitrust or competition policy gerrymandering. One case was about smartphones that excluded iPhones from their market definition. Another was about online shopping, in which they excluded Amazon and eBay from their definition of online shopping. I work at Google, and I can tell you the boxes that appear on my door every day do not say Google on them. They have a little smiley face. Moving on is tax. Tax. The internet there was a key line about internet tax freedom. There's a long battle over that, and the US looks like it may be going in the other direction. European Union countries are going in the other direction. These are more of these digital walls that I said are being built. Italy, France, also Chile, Indonesia. It's an important thing to remember is these are global enterprises. They're all looking at what are called digital service taxes. Italy has passed one. The French tried to get the European Union to pass one. And the way they've written those basically ring-fence American businesses and tax the big successful American businesses, which they largely don't have because they don't have the intermediary liability protection or the fair use protections that US has. So instead they're bringing in lots of money. I think something like 95% of their fines are on US companies. Oh, I'm down to 1 minute and I've barely gotten to how to prepare you for this fight. I will make one more reading recommendation since I won't be able to get through all of his arguments. If you're not familiar with Adam Thier at the Mercatus Center, Adam Thier at the Mercatus Center wrote a book called Permissionless Innovation. That's what the policy argument comes down to. If you want to participate in this debate, and it's clearly important that you do, because the most libertarian thing in the world is under encroachment from government, you need a prism through which to look. Think about permissionless innovation versus the precautionary principle. Adam's book outlines it beautifully. The short of it is the US took the permissionless innovation route, and they said, the question is, should the innovator seek permission from a government bureaucrat before rolling anything out? Should they be able to prove that no possible harm, no possible bad harm can be done by their innovation before they're allowed by the government to let it go? Or should they be allowed to do that, rely on current torts? If there is harm, there is recourse through those, or maybe some laws need to change in the future. Or should the opposite be true, which is precautionary principle? Should we require innovators to prove that nothing bad can possibly happen? Should we say you have to prove that the worst case scenario can't happen at the expense of the best case scenario? Because that's what doesn't happen. Fortunately, this is a big deal. Fortunately, I think everybody in this room, with their knowledge of markets and competition and their Hayek, and if they read Adam Thier, their permissionless innovation, is well positioned to engage in this fight. And I hope that you do. Thank you.